It is my great honor to introduce Yvonne Pine. She is so deeply rooted in this community and really needs no introduction in so many ways, but I am new to her. So Yvonne Pine graduated from UCLA in 1958 with a BS degree in nursing. And she worked with the Los Angeles County Health Department as a public health nurse. She's held many satisfying volunteer positions over her life, including Cal State LA Faculty Wives Fundraiser, PTA President, Girl Scout leader, Boy Scout fundraiser, and League of Women Voters member and leader for 35 years and more, showered with community honors. So thank you so much for being our moderator this evening.
I'm challenging all of you to go home after today and really talk it up, because you're going to become now an expert. The League of Women Voters has a publication to help you make a decision called Pros and Cons. They will be available in the back right after this presentation. And now we would like to hear from Jonathan Kaplan, who is from the California Budget Project. I didn't tell him this yet, but I happen to be very familiar with Jean Ross, who was their executive director until recently, and somebody I'm extremely fond of, in the sense that she has always been a wonderful supporter of the League of Women Voters and has been willing to give us the straight information at all times. Jonathan is a senior policy analyst for this project, which is a organization that's supported by donations and grants and is not a political organization. And so, believing that knowledge is power, Jonathan has come to share knowledge with us. Jonathan.
Hello, everybody. Wow, lights and all, huh? All right, so I'm going to be talking to you today a little bit about the California budget and how the propositions that are on the November ballot interface with that budget, and provide a little bit of the context in which those ballot propositions are placed relative to where we have been and how we actually arrived to where we are today. But before I do that, can I just take a show of hands? How many of you have ever heard of the California Budget Project? Okay, that's a fair amount of you. Okay, so the Budget Project is an independent nonprofit organization located in Sacramento, where we focus on analyzing state budget issues from the perspective of middle and low-income Californians. We've been doing this work since 1995. As was mentioned, we are independent from state government. We do not have any sort of affiliation to what's happening in state government, but we report and provide information about what's happening with respect to state budget issues. I have been at the California Budget Project since 2006, and I focus mostly on K-12 and higher education issues. We recently put out analyses of both Propositions 30 and Proposition 38. I was involved in the analysis of Prop 30 and wrote the analysis of Prop 38. We also put out a side-by-side sort of look at the two initiatives recently. And you can find all that information on our website, which is www.cbp.org. It's up here. You can also get on our mailing list. I think there's a sign-up little index card outside if you want to get our information. We don't share your information. We're just trying to provide updates as to when we put out publications. And if you want to get in touch with me after this presentation, feel free to email me at the Budget Project, and I will have that you can find me through the website as well. So what I'm going to be talking to you today about is basically three things: providing some context, so the social and economic context of the California 2012-13 budget, how we got to where we are today, and why schools are sort of in the center of the budget issues that are in front of us, and why it seems as if that's always the case. Then I'm going to talk to you as well about the current budget, that is what budget was passed in June, and finally the ballot measures and how that interplays with the budget that was passed this past June, the 2012-13 budget. But before I begin, I'm going to sort of give you the background here here and try to set things up by giving you a little information about why it is that you should care about this at all. Most of the time, folks, I think that dollars go up to Sacramento, they don't know how they're used, they're confused by what actually happens with state budget issues, and oftentimes feel as if they're very disconnected to how budget dollars are spent. But what I'm going to let you know is that nearly 3 out of 4 dollars that are spent by state government go through the state's general fund to local communities across the state, whether that be through nurses, teachers, healthcare providers, community colleges, various different items. And I'm going to show you a pie chart that will sort of break that down for you. You'll see that the bottom 2/3 of this pie chart the bottom 3/4 of this pie chart is really how I was explaining to you that dollars flow from the state budget into local communities, that whether it be through public schools, community colleges, flow through Medi-Cal program that supports low-income seniors, et cetera, what you call in budget speak local assistance dollars. And then the quarter pie slice that's up at the top, that actually is comprised mostly of the CSU and UC systems and the state correction system. So if there's a University of California or California State University campus near you, that's where the other dollars are going. So with respect to general fund spending, a large portion of the dollars that I'm talking to you about today are really flowing back to local communities across the state. So it's not, it goes to Sacramento and it stays up there. It's really money that are being brought in by state government and spent to support local communities. And now, before I go a little bit further, I'm just going to do a quick quiz, because I forgot to mention to you that prior to being an analyst, I was a high school history teacher for 8 years in the East Bay. And when I was a teacher, I, of course, like to give quizzes and try to put people on the spot. So I'm going to ask you a couple questions. And the first question I'm going to ask you is how much you think you know about how the state spends and receives dollars. Would you say that you, and I'm going to ask you to hold your answers, don't yell and scream, but tell me in a moment whether you think you know a lot, some, very little, or nothing. And then a second question I'm going to ask for you to answer is whether, which of the following represents the largest portion of state spending in the state's budget. Would you say that would be first, health and human services? The second would be prisons and corrections. The third would be K-12 education, and then the fourth would be higher education. So I want you to think about those two questions for a moment. And then what I'd like you to do is talk to a neighbor and tell them what you think in terms of those two questions for a moment. Just talk to somebody next to you and tell them what you think about the answers to those two questions. Okay, I haven't had lights on me like this in many presentations, but I'm going to try to get a sense here. What I'd like to do is just take a show of hands of how many of you think you know either a lot or some about how the state spends and receives dollars. Okay, good. It's about 3/4 or more of you. How many would you say you know not very little or nothing about those two? Yeah, it's about 1/4. Good. And then the second question I'll ask is how many of you think that health and human services are the largest portion of state spending in the state government budget? Okay, how about prisons and corrections? It's about 5 of you. And then K-12 education, the vast majority of you, good. And higher education. Okay, well, on the first question, that is how much you think you know about state spending and receiving of dollars. This is a question that's asked each year by the Public Policy Institute of California in January. The questions are in an annual survey. And in this past year, and at the Budget Project, we actually take it pretty much as our litmus test of how well we're doing at our job, is how many people actually are answering these questions in the way that is indicating that they have some understanding about how state budgeting works. What's interesting is that over half of the respondents said that they know some or a lot about how the state spends and receives its dollars. But then when you ask the second question about state spending, only 16% of those surveyed in the state of California could answer the question that K-12 education is the largest portion of state spending. And nearly half of respondents believe it's prisons and corrections. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about revenues as well. I didn't ask you that question, but fewer than 1/3 of adults successfully identified the personal income tax as the largest source of state revenue, and the sales and use tax as the second. And just 7% of Californians, less than 1 in 10, could actually name the #1 portion of state spending and the #1 portion of state revenues. So what this says is that there's a lot of misunderstanding out there in the public about some basic state budget issues, and I'm going to walk through a couple of those things with you, even though you actually did far better than the public as a whole. So first off, this is how the state spending breakdown works. K-12 education, as you'll see in the top portion of this pie chart, is roughly 40 cents on the dollar, 41.2 or 41.4%. Next on the list is health and human services, mostly the Medi-Cal and CalWORKs programs. That's about 1/3 of state spending. Next after that is higher education over on the right. That's the UC, CSU, and community colleges. And then last on the list is prisons and corrections, which is up in the sort of top here, which is about 9.7% of state spending. So this oftentimes is surprising to people, especially those that think that prisons are taking up a large portion of state spending. As it happens, if you look at, you can slice these numbers differently. The number of dollars spent per prisoner versus the number of dollars spent per student in this state is, it's far more per prisoner, but we have far fewer prisoners. And then secondly, the growth in prison spending has been quite dramatic in the last 10 years. But the basic principle here is that the largest portion of state spending goes to K-12 schools, and that has been the truth for a long time. So when you're talking about dollars being spent by the state or being raised by the state, every time you are spending $1 that's going to the state's general fund, 40 cents of those dollars are going to a local school. Now, when you're looking at the revenue side of the picture, this is how state general fund revenues are raised. What you'll see is that the largest portion of state revenue that goes to the general fund comes from the personal income tax, about 60 cents on the dollar. That's the largest pie slice here. And then the next on the list is the sales and use tax, or the sales taxes, which is about 20%. You put those two together and you're almost at 85 cents on the dollar. So that is how we raise dollars in the state. There are other portions, including the corporation tax and alcohol and tobacco taxes. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about taxes as we get through the presentation. But I wanted to give you some background, and now I'm going to give you some context in terms of how we arrived to where we are today. It seems as if folks we at the Budget Project say, well, if you're in a state budget crisis year after year after year, when is a crisis no longer a crisis, but just the way things are? And so what I'm going to try to describe to you is a little bit about how we arrived to where we are today. So some context. California has faced persistent budget shortfalls. And those persistent budget shortfalls have come in large part because we have a tremendous revenue problem in this state. The revenue problem in large part happened because there was a massive economic dislocation called the Great Recession that led to a sharp decline in state revenues. That recession that happened in 2007-8, when you saw from 2007-8, our revenue picture went from $103 billion in state revenues to the state general fund, and in 1 year we dropped $20 billion, from $103 to $83 billion in 1 year alone. Now, to give you some context about what that means, $20 billion, if you were to eliminate the University of California, the California State University, and the community colleges. You are just to say no more of those institutions that serve well over 1.5 million Californians, and not to mention how many they employ. You wouldn't get half of that $20 billion. If you were to add the correction system, that was at the time in 2007-8 roughly 165,000 state prisoners, as well as also the entire parole system, and the facilities that were associated to them, you are getting close if you were to add that to higher education to get to $20 billion. So to give you the sense of magnitude, it was a massive hit to state revenues. Why did that happen? Well, the California economy was based mostly, well, not mostly, but there was a heavy reliance in California on housing And the unemployment picture that happened here in the state of California was pretty dramatic and remains so. So this is a chart that shows you unemployment in this state. It's persistent unemployment, those that have been unemployed for 6 months or longer, and it shows you what it was at the beginning of the time period, roughly prior to the recession, roughly 150,000 people out of work for 6 months or longer, and then shows you what that spiked to in the 2009-2010 period. But the important part of this graph is it shows you that at its peak, we had 1 million Californians that were out of work for 6 months or longer. But today, many months after the peak, we are still at roughly 920,000 Californians out of work for 6 months or longer. What that means is that there are people who are not able to, well, first of all, what was that largest form of state revenue? The personal income tax. So these are folks who are not earning incomes, or at least as incomes as much as they were earning previously. They are also not spending money in the local economy. So personal income tax growth is down, sales tax revenue is down. The other impact here is on median household income. So when people lose their jobs, they are finding that their household incomes are going down. And if you look at this chart, it shows you on the bottom line is the United States as a whole, and the top line is California, and California has higher incomes, large part because we also have higher costs of living here. But if you see between 2006 and 2011, what we saw was a massive decline in median household income. In fact, the largest decline in median household income that we've ever seen, $8,000 between 2006 and 2011. That is a huge, huge decline in median incomes. And that had a dramatic impact on state revenue. So there are other reasons why, not just the recession, that the state budget has problems. And these are oftentimes policy decisions that are made by legislators in Sacramento. They're also things that are demographically a part of our state, the demography of our state. And I'm going to show you a few of those items. First off, lawmakers, even at the height of the recession, continued to pass what had been a penchant on their part for many years of tax cuts at the very time that revenues were going through the floor. And the tax cuts that were delved out in 2009, in February of 2009, were particularly egregious because they were given, it was a tax cut that was given in the future. That is, there was a deal that was cut to receive revenue in the early years to close the budget debt gap, and then to give a tax cut to the largest California corporations that was in perpetuity. In other words, that tax cut continues to this day and will continue forward unless there's laws to change it. But those tax cuts on the whole cost the state of California in general fund revenue this year alone $13 billion. So that, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. So the tax cut, what we did is a calculation of tax cuts that have been passed roughly over the last 20 years, since 1993. And what you'll see is a dip in the 2008-2009 year, 2009-10. In other words, there was these deals cut to receive revenue to close budget gaps in that year. But in this year, the 2012-13 year, if all those tax cuts had been rescinded, we would have $13 billion more in state general fund revenue than we do today. That dark of night tax cut, as we call it, is pictured here. We gained about $800 million in 2008-9, but as you'll see, in 2012-13, right here, we are losing about $1.8 billion in that one tax cut that we gave in this year alone. So what we say is, budgets are about values and choices, and each time that choices are made to give tax cuts to individuals or corporations, that has a cost on the state budget, and it's one that we're facing today. The other thing I'm going to point out to you is demography. This is a chart that shows you growth in the population. We grow in the state of California roughly by the size of the city of Riverside every year, 300,000 people in migration, as we call it. So every single year, California grows by about 300,000 people. But what's more important than that growth is where the growth is coming from. And what you can see here is a projection from 2000 to 2020 of where the growth in population is coming from. And the growth is mostly coming in the 65 and older population group. So we say at the California Budget Project, young people are cheap and old people are expensive. And the reason that is the case is it costs about $7,500, $8,000 a year to put a kid through a public school in the state. It costs about $55,000, $60,000 a year to put a person in a nursing home in the state. And more than half of nursing home stays are paid by the Medi-Cal program in the state. So when there is a growing portion of the state's population that costs large amounts of dollars, that has an impact on state spending. So I've now given you some context. How does the budget work? What were the situations and the history about how we got to the place that we are today? And now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the current 2012-13 budget. The 2012-13 state spending plan that was passed in June closes roughly another $16 billion shortfall. It does it in two ways, roughly half through spending cuts, deep cuts, including deep cuts to health and human services and to child care. But it also depends as well on revenues. But those revenues are only going to happen if a ballot measure that was proposed as part of the 2012-13 spending plan is passed by voters. So this is a graph, a pie chart rather, that shows you the breakdown of how they closed that $16 billion budget shortfall in June. The shortfall was closed, as I said, half in spending cuts on the right-hand side of the chart, and then that large sort of third there of temporary revenues, that is all associated to Proposition 30. So Proposition 30, which I'll be talking to you about a little bit in more detail in a moment, basically says that there's a ballot initiative that says voters will be voting on temporary tax increases both to the personal income tax and sales tax, and that revenue helps to close the 2012-13 budget gap. Now, if that tax measure does not pass, as part of the 2012-13 spending plan, there are in state statute signed by the governor are what are called automatic mid-year trigger cuts. These trigger cuts would target principally education to the tune of $6 billion in 2012-13, automatic cuts that are scheduled for January 1st of this coming year. $5.4 billion of those dollars come from K-12 and community colleges, $4.8 billion from K-12, $550 million from community colleges, $250 million each from the UC and CSU, and then a very smattering of small amount, less than 5% from a group of other portions of state spending. So this breaks down the trigger cuts into where those cuts would be taken from. As you can see, K-12 schools would take the lion's share of the reduction, and then after that, community colleges, UC and CSU, and then the other, as I said, is less than 5%. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Prop 30. Prop 30, as I said, is the temporary tax initiative that the governor compromised with others to put on the state ballot this November. And Proposition 30 basically raises personal income taxes on the highest income earning Californians, those earning $500,000 a year or more as a couple, $250,000 a year or more as an individual, and impose a 1/4 cent increase in the state sales tax. The income tax rates would be in effect through 2018, and the sales tax would be in effect through 2016. Proposition 30's revenues would be deposited into the state's general fund. But basically, there's a mechanism by which that happens, but the reason that it's important to understand that the revenues fall or come into the state's general fund is that has a direct effect on what's another proposition that was passed by voters in 1988 called Proposition 98. Proposition 98 is the minimum funding guarantee for K-12 schools and community colleges in the state, and so any dollar that increases revenue in the state's general fund affects how K-12 and community colleges are funded in the state. So, because the dollars help fulfill that Proposition 98 guarantee, roughly $2.9 billion worth in the 2012-13, it's actually the 2011-12, 2012-13 year. What that means is it frees up general fund dollars for spending in other areas. And that provides general fund budget relief. So the first step is it funds schools. The second step is that funding helps then other areas of state spending by freeing up general fund dollars for spending elsewhere. The other very complicated portion of Prop 30 has to do with what's called realignment. This is a portion of the 2011 budget deal that basically took many state services and transitioned those services to local counties for the local counties to actually take on what state responsibilities were. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that as we move forward here. But what I want to show you about realignment, because sometimes it's misunderstood, you'll hear sometimes out there that realignment and these Prop 30 dollars are actually being used for prisons or for local jails. And the reality is, actually it's only about a third that goes to public safety of overall the amount of realignment, and about 2/3 are going to a series of services that are many for child welfare services and others. I'd be happy to talk to you about what those services are. But it's important to understand that realignment is a key piece of the governor's proposal back in 2011 and today. And the other thing to understand is that realignment, to the degree that you understand what that means, basically is in the state law today, and it will continue to be in the state law tomorrow. There's nothing about Prop 30 that will cause realignment not to occur. All that it does is put it in the state constitution to make it more difficult for it to be changed in the future. But realignment was a part of the 2011 budget deal, and it continues forward whether Prop 30 passes or not. Okay, now I'm going to talk to you about Proposition 38, another tax measure on the fall ballot. Proposition 38 is sponsored by Molly Munger. She is the co-director of the Advancement Project, a local Los Angeles-based civil rights organization. Prop 38's taxes it's a new tax that would be modestly progressive, and it's a personal income tax on nearly all California taxpayers. So it raises tax rates on all Californians if you earn more than $7,300 a year as an individual, or $14,600 a year as a married couple. Now, those rates may or may not mean that any individual pays more taxes for reasons of deductions and credit. But what it is, I'll show you sort of how that pans out in terms of the actual payout by individual quintiles in a moment. But the measure does not address that realignment thing that I was talking to you about a moment ago. So it really has no effect whatsoever on realignment as I was describing it to you. The other key piece of Prop 38 is that it takes the dollars and it puts it into a special fund called the California Education Trust Fund. It would establish a new fund in state government. And what's key and important of your understanding there is that it's outside of the state's general fund. Therefore, it doesn't have an effect on the Proposition 98 guarantee. So that previous initiative that I was describing to you that basically is the guarantee for school dollars, Prop 38 does not affect that guarantee. And if there are general fund ups and downs, that will have its own effect on Prop 98, but Prop 38 will not have an effect on that. So, Prop 38's revenues, until the end of 2016-17, about 30% of all Prop 38 dollars will be used to repay state general obligation bond debt. About 60% of overall Prop 38 dollars will go to K-12 education, and 10% will go to early childhood education. The portion that goes to paying back general obligation bond debt is the portion that provides general fund relief. In other words, Prop 38's dollars that pay off state bond debt are dollars that the general fund does not have to pay. So every dollar that Prop 38 provides to general obligation bond debt relief means it's a dollar that the state gets in savings. That will exist through 2016-17. In 2017-18 going forward, there are potentially some dollars that will actually arrive in terms of general fund relief, but the LAO, that's the Legislative Analyst Office, which is an independent, an organization that is a Sacramento institution in terms of providing advice to the legislature, says that that would be about several $100 million a year, which sounds like a lot, but it's not a huge amount relative to the budget shortfalls that we've had. Prop 38, by not addressing the realignment issue, means that the state will still have to deal with realignment, and there are other implications for Prop 98 that I'll talk to you about if you wish and want to chat with me. And I'm going to show you now a couple charts that basically break down how it is that the tax increase would affect different quintiles of earners in the state. First Prop 30 and then Prop 38, they're the same charts for both. And you can find these charts on our website through our reports that we've put out in both of these analyses. And you can also find it afterwards when we post this to the web. And I think that'll be on the K-12 News Network or other, maybe the South Pasadena website as well. So what I'm going to do is show you first that Prop 30 would primarily affect the top 1% of income earners. So what you're looking at here is by quintile, that is by 20%. Each of these represents 20% up until here. And then from there, we go from the next 15%, the next 4%, and then the top 1%. And the top 1%, by the way, is income earners of $533,000 a year or above. And what you'll see is that the average tax increase, that's what this shows, would be greatest for those earning above $500,000 a year. And there would be an impact on every other income earner, but it's negligible in comparison. If you look at Prop 38, this is the Prop 38 impact by the same quintiles. You'll see that, once again, the top 1% are paying much larger amounts in overall dollars in terms of the amount, the average tax increase. But it also does affect those progressively moving forward. And you'll see that actually in the bottom portion, in large part because these are those that would actually receive tax credits and deductions that would mean that in many instances they wouldn't be paying any tax increase. Whereas the sales tax in the Prop 30 initiative would actually hit low-income earners to a certain degree, but you're talking less than $70 a year for those earning under $96,000 for anybody earning in the bottom 4/5 of income earners across the state. So I'm going to, I neglected to do something very important actually, which is to say the California Budget Project, which typically does not necessarily take positions on ballot initiatives, did take an endorsed position on Prop 30. We did not take a position on any other initiative and did not take a position on Prop 38. I can talk to you about that if you wish during questions and answers. But it's important for full disclosure to say I'm trying to give you as balanced a view here as I can, but you should know that our organization has taken an endorsed position on Prop 30. I'm going to talk to you just a little bit here about some tax facts, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. So, there's a lot of myths out there in the public about taxes and how the tax burden in the state is, a lot of people say we're in a very, very high tax state, or millionaires will leave this state if you raise taxes on those in the highest income earning quintiles, or highest top 1%. With the Budget Project, we spend a lot of time trying to debunk myths or trying to present data that actually demonstrates what it is that the facts are. So first off, California's problems, there's a lot of discussion out there. I've read it even, I think the was it the LA Times or the Sacramento Bee? Maybe, I can't remember which editorial this week or last actually talked about tax volatility. But the idea that somehow or another, in raising taxes on high income earners, that's a problem because dollars will fluctuate greatly. But the reality is, if you look at the growth of revenues over time, and you look at the ways that the state raises its revenue, what you'll see is that the personal income tax over the last 40 years has shown the highest average annual rate of growth. In other words, if you were to look at any tax of the taxes that we impose, from the tobacco tax all the way up to the personal income tax, if you look at growth over time, the personal income tax is the one that posts the largest growth. And so it is actually a very good tax in a lot of ways from the Budget Project's perspective because it shows growth and it's also progressive. It taxes those at higher incomes more. So we tend to think that the personal income tax is a good place to get your revenue. If you have to find revenue somewhere, assuming that you're saying revenue has to come from some tax, the personal income tax might be a good way to go. The other thing is that people tend to think that low-income households, that the tax burden is highest on high-income earners. But in fact, actually, low-income households in the state shoulder the greatest burden, the greatest tax burden of all income quintiles. And I'm going to show you that in a chart as well. This is a chart that shows you that the bottom fifth that is those earning less than $22,000 a year, are paying a greater percentage share of their incomes, of their overall household income or family income in taxes. Now, why is that? The personal income tax, while relatively high in the state of California, relative to other states as an example, that doesn't take into account all taxes. So the personal income tax is one tax. There's also the sales tax, which is regressive and actually hits low-income earners much more than high-income earners. But there's a variety of taxes: property taxes, alcohol taxes, gas taxes, etc. And when you take all of those taxes together, what you'll find is that the lowest income households in this state are shouldering the largest burden. That is, they're paying the largest portion of their incomes in taxes relative to other income earners. So when we look at taxes, what we're trying to see is, well, how can we spread the responsibilities of the state services to people in the society that are most able to afford it? And if you look at Prop 30, and we were to look at what that would mean, that if Prop 30 were to pass, what would it mean in terms of state revenues relative to the state's economy? In other words, state dollars coming in through revenue, how does that compare to the overall state economy or the ability of Californians to pay? That is another way of looking at it. It's relative to California's total personal income. And this is a chart that's going to show you over the last 40 years, since 1973, what revenues have been relative to the state economy. So this is looking at the California economy and the percentage of revenue relative to that economy. And what you'll see is that we've bumped along. We actually had some spikes here in the 90s and early 2000s. But even with Prop 30, if Prop 30 were to pass, what you would see is that state revenues would be lower as a relative portion of the state economy in 2012-13 than it was 40 years ago. So while there are many out there that would say we're in a high-tax state, the truth is relative to the ability of the state to pay for the revenues that it needs to be able to support public structures in our society, we actually are at a pretty low level relative to where we've been in the recent past. So the other thing we try to point to folks is to say, you know, there's a myth out there that we think should be debunked, which is that you shouldn't be raising taxes in the middle of a recession. Well, the reality is that, you know, you only have certain ways to balance state budgets. One of them is to raise revenue. Another is to cut spending. And if you look to Nobel Prize winning economists, Joseph Stiglitz is one of them, but there are many others as well. What they say is, what you want to be doing in a recession, if you have a choice between cutting spending and raising revenue or raising taxes, the unambiguous choice is to raise taxes on those who are most able to afford it. That is, in the highest income earning range. And the reason that's the case, if you want economic growth, is because if you were to state tax dollars that are apportioned through basically local communities, as I was describing it at the beginning of the presentation, those state tax dollars that go to local communities are spent through the local community. Whether it go to a public school, as we're in right now, it's spent on the services that are in your local community, on salaries that are then spent and go through the local economy. Whether it go to a local nursing home and the nurses that are there, or the services that are bought through the nursing home, those are things that flow through local economies and end up causing economic activity to continue. Tax rates for the highest income earners, maybe they're being spent locally, maybe they're not. Maybe they're being saved, maybe they're being invested in ways that aren't actually benefiting the state of California. So what we try to point out as well is that, as many of you have probably heard in the recent past, there's been a tremendous growth in income gains for those at the highest end of the spectrum. This is a pie chart that shows you of all the total gross income gains that have been made over the last 25 years or so. More than 3/4 have gone to the top 10% of income earners in this state. So if you were to aggregate all income together, what you'll see is that the biggest income gains, the largest amount of it, went to the top 10%, whereas the bottom 90% only took 25% of those income gains home. Now, to show that again in a different way, what you're looking at is the same time period, and what we're looking at is relative to inflation. How have income gains affected the different quintiles? So if you look through the quintiles, and once again, we're at the 4th, 5th here, which is those earning less than roughly $100,000. down to the bottom fifth, those earning less than $22,000 a year. And what you'll see is anybody in the bottom 80% of income earners, anyone in those income quintiles, have lost ground relative to inflation in the last 25 years. Whereas those earning in the top 20%, and especially at the top 1%, have seen their incomes dramatically increase relative to inflation. So, at the Budget Project, we think it's a good idea to actually be thinking about personal income taxes as a way to raise revenue, and Prop 30 is one way to do that. I'll leave you with a couple things that we also talk about at the Budget Project, which is that, California is a place of California's budget choices are always choices about their values and choices, things that we choose in our we choose in our households every day, how we spend our dollars, whether we should be saving for certain things, whether we should be spending on certain things. And values and choices are reflected in the way that we budget at the state level. The choices confronting California lawmakers and the state's public today are being sort of made in a false way, in a certain sense, to say that there's not enough resources out there. Because in fact, California possesses a tremendous amount of wealth. We have a substantial, we have robust industries, whether Silicon Valley, the entertainment industry in Los Angeles, other places that have been doing quite well in the economy despite the recession. And if you look at the combined income of California's millionaires as an example, and you were to look at that, you were to take all of the income of millionaires and you were to aggregate that together, this is the amount that you would be at. The total income of millionaires would be here. And you could pull every single Californian that's in poverty out of poverty 6 times over, just by the income of those that are earning over $1 million a year. So to just give a frame of reference about where dollars are in the economy and where we can actually readjust, this is one way to think about it. So I'll leave it with that, and I will gladly take questions and see whether or not we can engage in a little bit of a discussion about Props 30 or 38, or for that matter, anything on the state budget picture. This out of your way.
It's always nice to have the real information available. Thank you. Would you like a drink? Okay, great. The first question is, explain why anti-30 people say that the proposition would not contribute to schools. And secondly, why didn't the California Budget Project endorse Proposition 38?
So I'll take the second question first. We don't often take positions on initiatives. So the reason that we took a position on Prop 30 is it aligns with the Budget Project's philosophies of approaching state budget issues with a balanced approach and looking at the state budget as a whole, as opposed to what we call ballot box budgeting. Ballot box budgeting is making decisions in very complicated ballot propositions that are difficult for the public to understand or difficult for them to be able to sift through. And Prop 30 basically funds the entire budget. It is a balanced approach to the budget and a way to solve the structural budget shortfall moving forward, and to close the budget gap that has caused a crisis in the state for years at this point. So I can't really speak to exactly why the board of directors did not take a position on Prop 38, other than to say we don't usually take positions on initiatives, but I can speak to why it is that we took a position on Prop 30. So with respect to Proposition 30 and why those that criticize it say that the dollars aren't going to schools, well, it is a very, very complicated provision that exists previous to this one, Prop 98, that is at the center of all this. And as some people have said, when you start getting into Prop 98 land, and I've been there for many years now, prepare for your hair to hurt, because it's going to be difficult for most people to understand, even state budgeters who have been doing it for years. And those that criticize Prop 30 say that in fact actually the interaction, or this is the way I at least understand it, that the interactions mean that somehow this is not going to actually increase school funding. But the truth is that Prop 98 will be bolstered. That is, dollars going into the general fund will increase Prop 98 spending. There is no question about it. In fact, the difference between 2011-12 and 2012-13 in just Prop 98 spending will be about $6.7 billion. So how it is that what they're trying to do is to square and say, well, where would we be otherwise if Prop 30 didn't pass? And the problem is that we really don't have solid data to demonstrate that. So nobody can actually point to exactly what the per pupil spending figures would be. But I think that there's some projections on the other side that says that this is something that's not going to provide dollars to schools. But it's clear that Prop 98 and the guarantee for K-12 and community colleges will increase if Prop 30 were to pass.
This is just a quick question. Proposition 38 and 30 are taxing personal income. Is this on taxable income only or on the total income?
So that's a very good question. It's on taxable income. So when we're talking about the tax increases, we're talking on what taxable income is. And in fact, actually, Prop 38, so while tax rates increase on nearly all California taxpayers, that is those earning more than $7,300 as an individual, $14,600 as a couple, because of credits and deductions, what you'll see is that many people in the lowest quintile, I think it's only 14% or 15% of those earning less than $22,000 a year are going to pay any tax increase at all. So it's on your taxable income, and with credits and deductions it may mean that you're not paying taxes if in fact you fall into certain bands there. And we have information in our Prop 38 analysis that spells that out a little bit.
There are several questions here about the opinion of California Budget Project. With the California state's taxes the highest state sales tax in the nation, and California having the second highest income tax, why do you think California has a revenue problem and not a spending problem?
Well, it's clear that the revenue problem that I was demonstrating is, it's clear that when the recession hit, prior to the recession, we had a structural budget shortfall. What that means is that we were taking in fewer dollars than we were spending. And some would claim there was a spending issue there, that in fact actually we were spending too many dollars. And what we would point out is that if you look at growth in what we call caseload and inflation, we really didn't have a tremendous growth curve there. It was actually tracking pretty closely to what revenues were. And there were lots of tax cuts that were passed in the 1990s and 2000s. So there was a reason why revenues were coming in lower than expenditures. But in terms of sales taxes and personal income taxes being relatively high to other states in this country, while that may be true, the reality is we have some of the lowest tax rates in other areas of our revenue picture. For example, property taxes. So, to go in, not to bore you with tremendous amounts of detail here, but it used to be prior to 1978 in this state that local communities funded 2/3 on average of overall school spending for every community across the state. But with Prop 13, and the reduction in property tax revenue that happened overnight, roughly a 50% reduction in 1 year alone, what ended up happening was local communities now were not providing 60% anymore because property tax revenue fell through the floor. And the state stepped in and made up the difference. So what happened then was the state became the primary funder of K-12 schools in this state. So as a result, there was a tremendous pressure on the state to generate revenue. Now, how can the state generate revenue? It couldn't generate revenue through property tax rates, partly due to Prop 13, but partly due to the fact that it was local communities that actually received through their property tax revenue. It goes to local communities. But then secondly, Prop 13 also caused the state legislature to not be able to pass a tax increase unless they had a 2/3 vote of the legislative body. That's been in effect since 1978. So any revenues that the state would be able to try and raise, it was very difficult to do so. And in fact, actually, Prop 30 is in large part a result of the fact that the governor couldn't persuade a certain number of legislators to put this on the ballot last year. So he had to actually go out and get signatures to put it on the ballot this year. So while there are taxes amongst the many in the state picture that are relatively high to other states, we have some of the lowest tax rates as relates to alcohol taxes, as relates to other taxes that are basically the aggregate that cause the ability, that allow the state to actually support the public structures that many in the state need, and I would suggest are important for the California economy. So I hope I was able to answer that and that was satisfying.
How can we be sure that revenues raised by Proposition 30 will really get to K-12 education? K-14.
K-14, yeah. Well, there is the Prop 98 guarantee, which is in the state constitution, by the way, which is an important note. That any dollar that's going to Prop 98 is dollars that are going to flow to K-12 and community colleges. So the Prop 98 guarantee has existed since 1988. The real fact here is that the governor and the legislature is trying to piece together some sort of solution to, one, close the budget gap moving forward, but two, to provide dollars to schools so that the Prop 98 guarantee is fully funded. This is, in essence, the solution. Now, how to guarantee? Well, the guarantee is there in the Constitution. The reality is that Prop 98 actually, once the guarantee is fulfilled, that is, a certain amount of dollars are dedicated to K-12 and community colleges, at that point, it's the legislature's choice about how they apportion those dollars. So then it's up to you to talk to your legislators. I know that's sometimes not satisfying, but they really do listen to you. And in fact, actually, here in Los Angeles, you have a tremendous, legislative delegation that does a lot of good work. I see them in Sacramento all the time. And they're the ones who are going to make the decisions about where the dollars actually flow to. And those decisions are made every year. I watch them very closely. But the revenue limit portion, that is, the general purpose dollars that flow to schools, will clearly come from Prop 30. And Prop 30 will allow, and I think you'll be hearing a little bit from your district officials about what that actually means for the dollars that are flowing through into the school district. And I would suggest that while the legislature can decide to move dollars around within K-12 schools and community colleges, the dollars will actually come to K-12 and community colleges if it goes through if it bolsters the Prop 98 guarantee.
This is that issue is big in this community and in many. Did you get the answer that satisfies you? Does anybody have any other clarification that they need?
Sure.
I had a question about why is it called a revenue problem when we have the second highest income tax? That's the highest sales tax.
Okay, that's a different question. I just wanted to hear about this.
You said our property tax is low. That's not true. We have the 10th highest in the nation property tax rate too. So we have lots of tax burdens. I wanted to correct his mistake.
So actually, we have on our website fairly detailed descriptions of all the individual taxes that are accruing to state government. Personal income tax is 4th in the nation, not 2nd. I can't quote for you all of them, but I actually can show you a chart that shows you the data crunch. I mean, you may have a data source that's different than ours, but we take ours from the Franchise Tax Board and look at what that is relative to other states across the country. So I'd be happy to share that data with you if you wanted to take a look.
I trust more independent organizations get accurate.
You're welcome to do so.
Right. This is just a factual question. What do we spend in dollars per year per prisoner as compared to per student?
I'm not clear on exactly the data is changing actually quite significantly as relates to corrections, partly because of realignment. So what happened with realignment is that there was roughly speaking, I think at the peak I think it was about 2010, we had 175,000 state prisoners. We're moving down to about 130,000, I think, in the coming year. And what's happening there is low-level offenders are being moved from state prisons to county jails. In terms of that, part of that is the cost savings. The cost of putting a prisoner into a county jail is a lot less than it is at the state level. And as a result, I'm not clear on exactly what the per prisoner data is right now, but I could look it up for you. For whoever asked that question, I'd be happy to find it for you. In terms of per pupil spending, we are spending, roughly speaking, about $7,000 a year per student in K-12 Prop 98 spending this year, roughly about $1,270 less than we were in 2007-8. So that gives you a frame of reference about where we are in per pupil spending. But please come back and ask. I'd be happy to look up that per prisoner figure for you. I just don't have it at my fingertips.
Okay. Are there other ballot initiatives that would bring revenue to the general fund?
That's a good question. So Prop 39 is a ballot initiative that would close one of the loopholes that was passed in the 2008-9 tax year, that dark of night tax cut I was talking to you about earlier in the presentation. It's a complicated thing called the single sales factor. And there are other tax, so the question there is, I am embarrassed to say I don't know for certain that it actually shows up in the state's general fund. I think actually a portion of it does not, but I believe a portion of it does. So there are other measures on the ballot that do affect taxes. Prop 39 is one of them.
Does anyone else know if there's any other revenue? No, I don't think so. People are fairly concerned about taxes in general, so let me ask share with you a few comments. Why aren't Proposition 30 revenues not specifically earmarked for public education? When state revenues peaked, why wasn't money set aside for a rainy day, knowing that state revenues go up and down? In 2011, businesses left California, and this continues in 2012. With increases in taxes, what are the problems with shrinking the amount of businesses in California? And
we can take one of those at a time.
You want to do one at a time? Okay.
So what was the first one again? It was...
Why aren't Proposition 30 revenues specifically dedicated?
Right. So first of all, I can't speak to why often the choices are made. I'm not in the room when the choices are made, but Prop 30 actually technically dedicates, of the dollars that are raised, 89% to K-12 education and 11% to community colleges. Those dollars are dedicated to those two entities in the way that Prop 30 sets forth the revenues to be apportioned. What that does is it frees up spending elsewhere in the budget. So actually it does earmark dollars for specific parts of state spending in K-12 and community colleges. So that's the answer to that question.
State revenues peaked, why didn't we save some?
Right. Why is it that when state revenues peak, the legislature doesn't save dollars? Well, I don't have a good answer to that question. The reality is that when state revenues peaked, there were pressures on state spending even then, because we weren't actually, we were out of budget. We had a budget deficit that year as well. So in terms of revenues being set aside in a year where spending outpaced revenues, I think it would be difficult in that context unless you were truly reduced spending. So but I don't really have an answer as relates to exactly why the legislature chooses to do what it does when it does it.
Another question, what percentage of the 41.4% K-12 revenue goes to pension and health benefits?
So the general fund revenue dollars that are going to CalSTRS and to CalPERS in terms of any given year, you're talking about a relatively small portion of overall K-12 spending. Less, I don't have the percentage figures in my head, but I can certainly actually come back to that and answer it for you as well. But you're not talking about huge amounts in current year spending. So what ends up getting, I think, a lot of what we call oxygen in the room is pension obligations. That is how much we're setting ourselves up to pay in these benefits moving forward, as opposed to what's actually happening in any given year. And in the given year that we've been, last year, this year, you're talking about relatively small sums of money, but I think the concerns that are expressed have to do with what the obligations are moving forward. But whoever asked that question, please also come back to me and I'd be happy to get you the specific data on that as well.
Okay, I think we've covered most of the questions that are specifically about your presentation. Yes, I think I can see somebody. Yes, unfortunately the light is there. Please stand up.
Sure. Real quick, it says in the book that 38 cannot be amended by statute, but it can be by ballot. What's the status of 30?
It's the same. So 30, there's actually even, so the question was 38 can't be amended by statute. 30, what's the question? How does 30 work? Well, 30 also can't be amended, but more importantly, the realignment provisions in 30 go into the state constitution. So you would have to go back to the voters to change the provisions in Prop 30, and you wouldn't be able at the state level to change anything as relates to realignment unless you were to change the state constitution to do so. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I see another hand.
Hi, yeah, I just want to make sure I understand this.
Sure.
It kind of reminded me of when the lottery went through and everyone thought all this education dollars was going to go with the lottery.
Yeah.
And the state just pulled out money. So it basically replaced some money, right, so that they could spend it in other places.
Right.
So isn't that part of what it sounds like what you're saying about Prop 30 is the same thing? Is that it's not, the percentage of the Prop 30 money is going to go in there, but it's basically going to, they're not going to leave that other money that's already for education, or they're going to use it somewhere else.
So let me see if I can try to answer it and see if it's satisfactory, but please let me know if it's not. So yes, with the lottery dollars, by the way, lottery spending gets a lot of oxygen in the room as well. It raises less than 2% of overall dollars that our schools spend, and it never has, I did a lot of writing on the lottery several years ago. At the outset, I think it was maybe 3.5%, but it's been under 2% for years and years.
What's Prop 30 going to be? What percentage is that?
Prop 30, if it raised $2.9 billion in the 2012-13 year, that would roughly speaking be about 6-7% of overall K-12 spending in that for just dedicated to K-12 schools. So now moving forward, see so here's the important concept to try and get. If you put money into the general fund, that is monies that are raised and go into the state's general fund, will boost, increase the Prop 98 guarantee. Each year's Prop 98 guarantee is calculated based on the previous year's Prop 98 guarantee. So if one year Prop 98 spending goes up, that is the guarantee goes up, the next year the guarantee is a calculation based on that increased spending for the future year, with also a factor of what is the growth in California personal income, how is and changes in enrollment. So that's how the calculation is made, right? So you said, well, wait, aren't they taking dollars and spending it on K-12 schools, and then basically, but that's dollars that would have already been there, or they're replacing what would have been there. And the answer is, in some ways, to some degree, what you're saying is true, but what that doesn't get to is the increase in the 98 guarantee year to year moving forward. So when you increase 98 spending in the 2012-13 year, that, as I say sometimes to those in the school community, is the gift that keeps on giving, because it's the spending piece that then is the basis for the future year guarantee. If you're raising money outside of the guarantee, that doesn't have a constitutional minimum. It doesn't have an effect on the legislature in terms of how the legislature makes decisions about the 98 guarantee. So it does, Prop 30 provides general fund relief. It does provide dollars to schools and then provide general fund relief. But what it also does is it builds money into the 98 guarantee moving forward and will continue to provide dollars to schools even after the tax measures that Prop 30 includes go away. So once the tax measures are gone, the increased funding level for schools is still there. Does that help explain it? Okay. We're at time. Okay.
Yes?
I'm getting the book.
I have a question. You indicated that the tax breaks that we gave back a few years back created potentially a $15 billion deficit that continues today.
It's, just to be clear, it's $13 billion in revenue less. It's not a deficit. It's simply the amount that the state takes in is less. Yeah?
Can you remind all of us who gave the cuts? Number one, number two, what were they?
So
And then the third question is, what would it take to get that revenue back?
So very quickly, I can go through and actually explain to you all of the different portions of those tax cuts. It would take a long time, but I'd be happy to show you exactly when they were, what tax cuts they were and what they specifically, who voted for them. You'd have to go back into the legislative record.
The legislatures that made it, not the people.
Yes.
Correct. These were legislative decisions. And then the answer to your question, to get them back, the way it works is that you can pass a tax cut in this state with 50% legislative votes, but you can't pass a tax increase unless you have a 2/3 vote.
Right.
So every time you give a tax cut away, you're going to have a much more difficult time getting it back because it's going to require a vote threshold that is very difficult to actually overcome. So that is, that's part of the dynamic that's going on in the state capitol as it relates to revenue.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan Kaplan. That was really, really good. I appreciate it. Thank you for coming. It's a long way to go.